Okay, hi everybody. My name's Molly Schwartz, and I work at the Metropolitan New York Library Council in New York City. But I've been involved with this whole MyData thing since 2014, when I first moved to Finland and lived here for a couple of years. And I first heard about the concept because I went to this digital activism seminar, and there was someone there who was running for political office at the time, and he just mentioned MyData in passing. But it was such an intriguing concept to me, especially having moved here from the United States, and very quickly encountering radically different attitudes about data protection and different companies. And I felt like I needed some way to move forward and to synthesize these things and to have some kind of hope that there's a way that we can come to some sort of common understanding and a better future. So if you like, check out my Twitter feed. I've also tweeted out links to this, link to this presentation where there are some links to things I will talk about within here. And also, again, thanks to all the people who helped me take notes to do the information gathering to make sure that I could synthesize as much content as possible for this. I couldn't have done it without their help, and I'll name them at the end. And a quick warning, if any of you feel kind of sensitive about bugs, get ready, because there will be some in this presentation, and I don't mean the technical kind. So first, to give some attribution to where this whole concept came from, I'm basing this presentation off of Valérie Pujol's wrap-up from last year, which was fantastic. There's a link at the bottom here to the YouTube video. I'm not going to go through all of her points. She gave 14 of them, and even though they're kind of listed here, she really went more in depth in the video, and so I entreat you to look at them. And also, I actually followed her model, and I very much agree with this statement that she made at the beginning of her talk last year, which was that at first, when she was charged with the task of doing a summary of the whole conference, she agreed, and then she was like, oh no, why did I agree to this? But then in the end, she was glad she had this task because she really was very focused during the conference, and I totally agree with that. At first, I was like, why did I ever agree to this? But it really made me listen attentively. And I'm gonna follow her model of first identifying what I consider to be 5 points of convergence I saw throughout the conference, so things that people agreed on, 5 points of tension, and then 5 points that I think were maybe touched upon but kind of missing, and things that we should address more in the future. So first, points of convergence. I warned you about the ants. I kind of liked the bug theme because ants, to me, are these kind of very complex groups of social creatures that all kind of do their own things, but in concert, they're really amazing. They sometimes act like solids or like fluids. They sometimes make little balls together. And so these are ways in which I feel like there have been people going off and doing their own thing, and then during the conference, we all come together and see that we were working toward common goals. So the first major theme that I saw throughout this conference, which was kind of surprising, but I was quite pleased by, was that people keep returning to the topic of semantics. I heard people talking about semantics in terms of philosophy and the language that we're using to describe these concepts, but also to talk about technical concepts like the semantic web and how we're creating common protocols that will work together, that will be the baselines for our infrastructures. I also think that this is incredibly important because sometimes people ask, what is MyData? And the most common answer is that MyData is a movement. But in order to have a movement, you have to have some kind of consensus and agreement, which requires paying attention to language. And actually, sometimes people get frustrated when they feel like outcomes from things are a report or a paper, but really it was when Yogi Poikkola and Kai Kuikaniemi and Hari Hanko came together with a group of many others to really formulate this MyData concept into a paper, which I then actually first kind of engaged with this project by helping to translate it into English. That was really the birth of this whole conference and this whole movement, was defining the ideas that we were going to come together around and then build things on top of. And then, interestingly also, as I heard a lot of metaphors during this conference. So I heard data sales being compared to selling organs. I heard comparisons of people to pigs, so like people in the data market are like pigs in the meat market. I heard comparisons of data to oil and then strong rejections of the comparison of data and oil. I heard data compared to electricity. I heard data compared to lots of colors. Data is the new green. Data is the new black. I heard it compared to roads and railroads and streams. There was also an entire track in this conference called Our Data. So my data, our data, there's lots of terms flowing around, and semantics are very important. And actually, There are many founders of large tech companies who studied philosophy and semantics, so it's not something to ignore, so I'm glad we're focusing on it. A second point of convergence that I'd like to mention is this concept of measuring value. So if we're somehow agreeing that there's a current model that isn't working for us, then how do we come to a common measurement of what does work for us? John C. Havens gave a presentation about how GDP is a really bad measure of how much a society is prospering. Well, then what measure should we use? Should we measure things based on happiness, based on fairness, based on risk, based on consequences? This is something that I saw people come back to again and again. And something that I also think is interesting was this kind of running theme throughout the conference of many people asking, what's the use case for MyData? Where are the use cases? What's the business model? And there sometimes seems to be, and I'll get to this maybe more in points of tension, this tension between whether MyData is coming from a profitable new business model, or is it coming from a point of ethics and kind of the right thing to do? And I think that gets to measure how we measure the value. Then something else that I saw mentioned a lot of, which Yogi really kicked off in his opening plenary, was this concept of slow layering. He was talking about this concept of pace layering by Stuart Brand, and the idea is that as things evolve, there are different layers, and some happen more quickly and some happen more slowly. And you can see things like cities evolving this way, and I think the layers are fashion, commerce, infrastructure, governance, culture, nature, or something like that. And he actually mapped each of these layers to how things have been evolving within the MyData movement. And the point being that sometimes fashion can change quickly, or on the infrastructure layer, technical solutions can change, maybe not as quickly as fashion, but still pretty quickly. And then governance, now we're starting to get to regulations. But really what's interesting is that if MyData is imagining a different kind of future and a different model, you're really getting to that culture layer, which takes a lot longer to change. But if you think about what kind of consequences the personal data management system has on our lives, we really want to get it right because it will last, and we want to build an infrastructure that will last. So rather than necessarily focusing on how successful have the different PIMS models been since last year, maybe we should think about this in terms of really being a long game. Another point of convergence I noticed was that there are lots of different modular solutions that people are coming up with. I personally was really happy to learn about all the different projects that have been ongoing or happened within the last year that are really tackling different pieces of the MyData model, some of them coming from governments, some of them coming from companies. I heard about really awesome open data initiatives happening in Barcelona. I heard about the National Patient Portal being developed in Iceland that's implementing MyData principles in the realm of health. I heard about the X-Road model that Estonia has for its digital government services and how Finland's actually going to be working together to connect to that. I heard about Maison Faux coming out of France, which is really a pilot of MyData concepts. I heard about companies that are really coming up and thriving, like Cozy Cloud, which is an open source personal cloud, or DigiMe, which actually allows for that data transfer layer between different kinds of services. So to me, I see these as people in different places tackling different problems in ways that are all interoperable and will work together. So it's cool people are doing things. And something else that I thought was really fascinating was when we talk about MyData, we come back a lot to this concept of digital identity and identity systems. And I heard some people talking about how it's not necessarily just people who have an identity in this digital world, but also maybe companies have a digital identity, or your vehicle could have a digital identity, or you as a person could have multiple digital identities, and how do these all work together? And I think these will be big problems to tackle. Then also, of course, I could not leave out GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations that are now here upon us. Implementation is happening / coming. And all of you are somewhat familiar, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I heard a lot of discussion around Article 18 and the concept of data portability, people pointing out that there are two different things happening here. One is your right to access your data, and one is your right to actually have data portability. And there was a really interesting unconference session that I attended on the boat on the way from Tallinn, where people from Open Knowledge Germany were talking about a portal that they're trying to build that will make it easy for people to request access from companies and making sure that they're really getting all of the data back or the data back that they need. Because there is some concern that the ways that companies will respond to the GDPR is by preemptively building systems that make it easy for you to access the data that they want you to have, or that's convenient for them to give to you. So how do we audit and make sure that we're actually getting all the data back, or getting the data back that we need, or getting it back in the format that we want? And so maybe it's up to us as a community to preemptively build the models that will work the best for us, rather than waiting for it to come the other way around. And Katrina Dow made the excellent point that the DPOs, the new data protection officers, are going to be our new designers. So we should pay close attention to how they end up executing things. So now moving from ants to worms, points of tension. So I was thinking of points of tension as like worms. You know, you can cut them in half, and sometimes it hurts and they go in different directions, but they do grow back. And actually, it's a misconception. Earthworms, both sides don't grow back, only the one with the head grows back. But there are other kinds of worms that you can actually slice up to like 1/100th of their side, and they will regenerate. So that's how I think of us. So points of tension. The first one I saw as a point of tension is informed consent. So consent management is at the core of MyData. But right now, consent kind of functions in a binary way with terms of service, which most of us agree do not really work. But the idea being that in order for us to make these systems work, we have to have some kind of binary measure, yes or no, we opt in or we opt out. And in order to make that more nuanced and make sure that we're actually making informed consent, how does that happen? Can informed consent, in fact, be binary? And to me, that also, I heard some interesting points about implementing consent as kind of a dialogue. So maybe when you start a service, it's like first you're presented with one piece of information, then you respond in a way that kind of makes it so that the information, the knowledge really gets transferred as to what is happening when you sign up to this service. And to me, that gets at a deeper question of how we transmit information effectively so that it actually becomes knowledge. And to me, that means we need to look at pedagogical models and how to teach people in effective ways, and how that can affect how we design our consent systems. So my mind goes to, like, do we have tutorials or something, like YouTube tutorials? I don't know. Another point of tension I saw was around kind of the idea that MyData is predicated on the idea of individual empowerment, and how much responsibility we're giving to individuals when you give all their data back to them, and whether or not this is a good thing. Will empowering individuals with their data, depending the way you do it, will people feel liberated, or will they feel abandoned? And I see this come up a lot in conversations around health, and whether systems work better if people are managing their own health data. There's strong arguments and evidence in favor of the fact that yes, people do have better services and make better decisions when they have access to all their health data. And there are other people saying that if you have a good general practitioner, you want an expert actually managing this for you, and maybe we should make sure that they're getting access to all the data. I don't know. But this is something that I heard come up again and again. Another is the question of accountability, and this kind of relates back to the idea of how do we measure things. Another big piece of MyData is making sure that we're using services that we can trust. But how do you determine that? Do we kind of mark certain companies as good versus bad? Do we rely on watchdog organizations like Data Ethics EU to tell us which companies are good actors and which are bad actors? And what measurements are they using to decide that? Do companies need to use open source tech in order to be transparent, in order to be trustworthy? Do they need to sign the MyData declaration? And if so, how do we audit them? This question of accountability, I think, is a big one. Another thing that I heard come up again and again that was really fascinating was talks about privacy. Lynette Taylor today summarized really well a recurring theme about the concept of group privacy and social privacy, and the idea that inherently data and when you do things almost never involves yourself. The fact that a piece of data is being generated means that you're having some action that is somehow abstracted and agreed upon between two parties. There's always another party involved when it comes to data transfer. And so we need to start thinking about privacy in terms of a relational thing rather than a way to give you autonomous control over your data that somehow you can keep it in a lockbox. That's really not feasible, but I think that we haven't come up with any systems of protecting social privacy. And some people are saying that actually the whole privacy ship has sailed, and MyData and privacy are not the same thing, and maybe we should be working toward anonymity. And then people make points that anonymizing data can oftentimes be de-anonymized. So this is a big recurring question. And another thing that I thought was really interesting that came up was this concept of data as liability. Stuart Lacey talked about the idea that data can also be liability, that big data isn't always a good thing, that sometimes you can have too much data or bad data, and once you anonymize data, it actually becomes less valuable and kind of dirty and muddies your systems. And I hear a lot of talk around the idea of data minimization, and maybe this is the way that we should go. And that does raise questions about, will data minimization make things more efficient? Or I really liked Katrina Dow's talk about how we could be at this point where we either turn toward digital feudalism or a digital renaissance, that we could be at this tipping point, and how much is digitalizing services really the goal of MyData or not? So these were the points of tension. Now the missing points, when we can hopefully turn from caterpillars into beautiful butterflies. These are things that I think we're kind of on the outskirts of conversations, or I would like to bring farther into the center. So the first one that I see is education and outreach. Again, returning to this concept of pedagogy and how to turn this into a movement. It means we need effective ways of communicating our ideas and reaching people at younger ages. I was excited to hear that there's a European handbook for teaching data privacy and data protection at schools, and it was cool to see the King Gaffa video and seeing people engage in ways that help communicate ideas that reach larger audiences. And me coming from a library background, I really hope that we start looking to organizations that are already community-based, and they're already on the front lines of people interacting with technology, sometimes for the first time. And we really need to do more outreach to these kind of organizations to make sure that these principles get put into practice. Another missing point that I heard, especially because there are different movements and trends that come up. This year it was AI and artificial intelligence, and with that, it made me think of this problem of black boxes and intellectual property. When we're talking about AI, algorithms are a huge thing. What kind of services are being developed that remain black boxes? And so much of the digital economy is today predicated on the concept of intellectual property. So how do we deal with that when we're trying to change the model? The next was this concept of data portability. Obviously, data portability is a huge thing when it comes to implementing GDPR, but I still saw a lot missing about who will take the lead in making sure that data portability happens in the right way. Is it going to be a collaborative process? What are the standards? How do we distinguish the rights to get the data from the rights to transfer the data? And another big thing that I heard come up again, kind of more so this year than last year, was talk around data ownership, which I think is quite dangerous if we start talking about data as property when we're truly trying to establish that we have rights to our data, because that means that it can be traded away or sold. And another thing that I think was missing is that maybe we need to move beyond GAFA or GAFAM. There are other companies out there that are less visible, like Salesforce, that are incredibly large and have really big black boxes around their IP. And also, to me, especially being from the US, it raises questions about how inclusive is this movement and how inclusive do we want it to be. I heard a lot of conversations about this people wanting to move toward more European-centric solutions, which I think is interesting and worth considering, but I think definitely when we're talking about MyData and seeing hubs pop up all over the place, including places like Brazil, how much is MyData supposed to be a Europe-centric movement? I don't know, and it gets to interesting questions about the concept that laws and regulations are local, whereas technology doesn't necessarily act according to these borders, and so maybe we need to stop focusing on where companies are from. So now, quickly, I want to bring up this concept of where are we going? I was excited to get the opportunity to do this session again because it allowed for some really deep listening, and I love the MyData movement. But I did wonder a little bit, like, why am I doing this? I'm from the US, I'm a librarian, and as I mentioned briefly at the beginning, when I moved from the US to Finland, I had to really reorient my kind of cultural associations with certain companies. When I was in the States and I heard about friends going on to get jobs at Google, I was like, wow, cool, Google has awesome services. And becoming a librarian was something that I did because very much something that drives me professionally is that I think having more access to knowledge and information improves people's lives, and information should be free. But I've come to realize that sometimes understandings around information being free has strong cultural connotations. And so I think that if we want this to be something that develops locally and at grassroots levels, we need to figure out how to include people and how people plug in, especially if they're not a technologist or they're not involved in legal things or they're from different places. And also, I just included a little link to a presentation that I gave at the Worldcon conference here in Helsinki a couple weeks ago, which is the World Sci-Fi Convention. And it was something, when we're trying to imagine where we're going, I think it can be important to look at other tools like sci-fi that allow us to really kind of model how potential alternative futures look. And I did an analysis of Hannu Rajaniemi's book, The Quantum Thief, and how his conception of Gevulat is actually really comparable to MyData, and it shows how this kind of system could potentially work in a future alternative world. So thanks very much. I'm Molly, and then again, thanks from Marine, Jesse, Guillaume, Tuukka, Sarah, Manon, Matti, and Juho. And I hope you all liked the bugs. Thanks.